we will be able to a lot if you love history the way we do, especially this kind of history. There is just volumes of information that would be beneficial to all of us. But we're going to do the best we can. But again, for housekeeping, so the plan is, now John had thyroid surgery last week. So the plan is that I'm going to take the first 2 weeks and that he will be ready to go on the 3rd week, which, if everything goes to plan, will be perfect because I am on baby watch. I've got my 2nd granddaughter coming, hopefully in about 3 weeks. But depending on when she decides to show, I may be here and I may not. So, we'll just have to hope that she stays on schedule, and that I'll be here for the first 2 weeks. And I'm going to spend the first 2 weeks actually getting us to the restoration movement, which I'll get to in a minute. Let me see, any other housekeeping things? I can't think of any. Okay, all right. Okay, so why study history? I mean, other than the fact that, you know, some people just really like history, like me. I just love it. I enjoy learning the why of how things came to be. Most of y'all know I appraise houses, and I enjoy going into old houses. And sometimes if I go into an old house, I'll just stand there and just try to imagine what it was like when this house was new, and how the family, you know, lived in that house, and so on and so forth. I guess I'm just weird that way. But history, you know, not everybody enjoys history, but history is important. Even if you don't enjoy history, history is important. Why? Well, history gives you your identity. What is, and you don't hear so much about it now, but maybe 10 years ago, or in the last 10 years, put it that way, what was something you heard advertised on television all the time? Ancestry.com, right? And what did Ancestry.com, or there were some others, but what was their promotion? What was it that they proposed to do to trace your history? They could use your DNA, right? I mean, that's kind of an incredible thing, right? I mean, if it's actually true, somebody in our family did it for my mom, and we weren't surprised at all what came back. We were so English Scottish, I mean, there's just no getting around it. But some people, you know, find some interesting things about who they are and where they came from. It gives us our identity. And what else? Well, we can learn from the past, right? We can, if we pay attention to mistakes that were made, or we pay attention to things that were positive, we can learn from our past. The problem is, so often we don't learn from our past, and we continue to make mistakes over and over and over. But if we pay attention to history, we can learn. All right. I think I want to do this before. When you think about restoration, what comes to mind? Just the word restoration, not necessarily in a church setting, just the word restoration. What comes to mind?
Bringing something back.
Okay, bringing something back, and specifically, what would you think about in bringing something back? What?
It's original.
Okay, but give me something specific. Furniture? Okay. Yeah, I didn't think about furniture, but yeah, okay.
A tooth.
A tooth? A tooth. I sure didn't think about a tooth. I was thinking more like, we have television shows, right, that are all about restoring old houses, right? Now, typically, what kind of house gets restored? A 1970s ranch? No. Those get sort of renovated, right? But not restored. Old houses like this get restored. Why?
They have a history.
Okay, they have a history. What else? All right, they have value, they have character, there's something valuable, there's something appealing, there's something special about them. All right, what else? Anybody restore cars? Yeah, Tommy, did you just say automobile? Yeah, so anybody restored a car before? It's something, Corey, you have? How was the experience? I mean, was it just sort of a cosmetic deal or an extensive take it down to the,
I was helping my dad, was taking it all the way down to the frame, get all the rust out, Bondo, metal, sanding, the whole thing.
all the way back to the original. And what kind of car was it?
It was a 63 Chevy pickup truck.
63 Chevy pickup truck. Yeah, probably not a 1972 Plymouth Duster, right? I mean, there's certain cars, but yeah, this idea of restoration, we want to take it back to its original glory. Okay? Now, why does restoration become necessary? And think about those two images I just showed. Why does restoration become necessary?
Deterioration.
Okay, deterioration from what? Typically. Age. Exposure. Neglect. Yeah, neglect. We just quit taking care of it, and it falls into disrepair. Heavy use, maybe. All right. What else? Think about houses more so than anything that might bring them to a point of needing to be restored. What do people do typically to their houses over years and as owners change? All right, they remodel, they alter, they add things, they change things. They bring the house to the current fad, right? The current trend. And then at some point, somebody looks and goes, you know what? This house doesn't resemble at all its original beauty, its original glory. Let's take it back to its original condition. Let's restore it. All right. Why would restoration be necessary in the church? Okay, we get away from important principles. What else? How far back do you want to go? Okay, say more.
For me, the start of the restoration would be around Canossa, when the Pope had to meet with the king and establish kind of a separation of church and state, basically.
Okay, all right. Hold that thought because we're going there. Why else? What else happens in churches over the years that would cause at some point you to say, wait a minute, we need to go back?
Starts looking like everybody else.
Okay, yeah, I mean, we traditions get a part of what we do, and we totally forget why it is we're doing what we're doing, and then what happens? You have a tradition starts, and somebody says, no, that's not okay, and take it to its extreme, and what happens? It splits, right? And we have all these denominations, we have all of these different opinions, and so at some point we stop and we go, wait a minute, this isn't right. We need to go back to the source. We need to go back to the original. Have you ever considered why God told Lot and his family not to look back at Gomorrah and Sodom when they were leaving? I don't know this to be the case. I just thought about this. Why would he have said, don't look back? And when Lot's wife looked back, she was turned to a pillar of salt. Why might he have said, don't look back? Forget about the past. Sometimes it becomes necessary to forget the past. That is what happened with the Puritans who came to the New World. They said, we want to forget about the past and all of its decadence and all of its traditions. We want to get back to the original. We want to get back to Scripture. And this was echoed by Barton W. Stone later on. A more recent ancestor of ours, he said this: the past is to be consigned to the rubbish heap upon which Christ died. The stream of Christian history has become so littered with human inventions that such pollutions in the pure waters of truth must be bypassed altogether. People must make their way back upstream to the source, the spring itself. But we're sort of offered a challenge in that, because on the one hand, we say we need to forget our past, but what if we don't confront our history and learn how we got to where we are today? What's going to happen? If we just seek to restore and not pay attention to restorations that have happened in the past, then what's going to happen? Yeah, new traditions are going to be embraced, just as every group has tried to reject tradition and restore the primitive church, develop their own traditions. These groups include the Zwinglians, the Puritans, the Baptists, who we're going to talk about. Those will be next week, and then John will start talking about more recently, our direct ancestors is Stone, Alexander Campbell, and David Lipscomb. All of these groups sought to restore, but what happened within their movements is they established traditions that they didn't quite get there. Nobody ever seems to be able to get there. So over the course of this quarter, we'll talk about the Stone movement, the Campbell movement, the convergence of these movements, the Missionary Society controversy, the Civil War ordeal, the influence of the editors, and I've got special guests coming to talk about that, the lines of division, 20th century growth, and the continuing restoration. So hopefully we'll be able to get into all of these. There's a lot here, but hopefully we'll be able to get into all of these topics. Okay, so let's look briefly at how we got to what we're talking about, the Restoration movement, that starts actually a very, very long time ago. In fact, you have to go back to the 5th century. The barbarians of Northern Europe shattered the Roman Empire. And when they destroyed the empire, they destroyed the culture. Now, remember, this was Greco-Roman culture. It was very philosophical. It was very educated. There was a lot of emphasis on learning. And so any wholesale learning was done away with. And for 1,000 years, the world was plunged into what we call the Dark Ages. Now, spiritual life was dominated by ignorance, superstition, and dependence. Now remember, life was a feudal system in which you had a tier of the king, then he had feudal lords, you had individual fiefs, then you had peasants, right? And so the Roman Catholic Church came to dominate culture and politics, and virtually everyone was dependent on the church for eternal salvation, because the church controlled the 7 sacraments, and it held the power of excommunication and therefore could not be challenged. So they were able to institute a system wherein if you wanted to take issue with the Catholic Church, what would happen? You would find yourself probably burned at the stake. And we'll see that happen to somebody that's going to come up in a minute. And other forms, you know, but if the church had control of your eternal salvation by simply excommunicating you, and they could excommunicate a whole country, they held power. They held ultimate power. So by the dawn of the Renaissance, now we're up to like 1300, Christianity consisted of people controlled by superstition and dependence on a feudal god. So the idea was, you know, the peasantry believed in angels, demons, you know, lots of superstitions. Alternatively, churchmen and theologians, so the religious elite, indulged themselves in scholastic disputations, all right, debates, almost wholly unrelated to the lives of common people. So you had this combination of church and state. The church was the state, but the church was very separate from the people. The Scripture was wholly forgotten. You remember in the Old Testament, when they had so forgotten the law that when they found it, they were like what is it? This is the law? We didn't even know there was a law. And you wonder, how in the world could that happen? This is the way that happens. It's when the church comes into control. In the church, there's no accountability. And they find themselves more interested in theological debate that has nothing to do with the Bible. Okay. Now, there were a few dissenters that called for reform, in some instances, even a restoration of the primitive Christianity. These are men like John Wycliffe and John Huss. But both of these men were challenged, or the Catholic Church took exception to these guys. They burned John Huss at the stake. Their followers were forced underground, and that is how they existed. So there wasn't much challenge to the Catholic Church. The Renaissance then began in the 1300s, and a new individualism among Europeans created created a sense of individualism. They no longer sort of experienced this feeling of dependence. They sort of threw off the feudal system. And this, the problem was that this individualism expressed itself as faith in the natural reasoning and ability and creativity of humankind. So what happened as we came out of the Dark Ages and this individualism, people sort of drifted away largely from whatever the Catholic Church and medieval values were. Art, literature, music, and scholarship of all kinds flourished during this period. Now, Renaissance thinkers, religiously speaking, looked to, or few of them, looked to a sovereign God to empower them to do good. A person chose freely to do good and achieved this through determined effort. Now, what does this sound like? If you don't depend on God for your morality, who do you depend on? Yourself or human beings, right? So what do we call this? They sought to return to the fountainhead of wisdom and learning. I'll come back to this in a minute. The teachings of the ancients. And this was the birth of humanism. Okay? So these thinkers concerned themselves with the wisdom of ancient pagan philosophers in Greece and Rome, people like Plato, Seneca, Cicero. So what they sought to do was to find these ancient manuscripts and teachings from these philosophers, and in so doing, they patterned their lives after the teachings of these humanists, of these Greek philosophers. Now, humanism, what is humanism? In your own words, somebody, what is humanism? Do you know? Anybody? Basically, humanism says that human beings are good enough to determine their own morality. Okay? Just in your own words. Here's a definition. An outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. So we don't believe in God. We don't believe in the supernatural. We believe in the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems. Now, another word for this, and we're seeing it very much today, what's another word for this that's very in vogue this day? What kind? Starts with a W. Woke. Woke is humanism. It is. A Renaissance cultural movement, now this specifically speaks to humanism in the Renaissance. It was a cultural movement which turned away from medieval scholasticism and revived interest in ancient Greek and Roman thought. Okay? But what about this idea of Christian humanism? Christian humanism? Well, now wait a minute. We just defined humanism as human, right? So this Christian humanism would be an oxymoron, right? Those two words are mutually exclusive. They don't go together. Well, surprise, surprise, they actually do. There were Christian humanists. And these scholars sought recovery of ancient wisdom as well, just not of pagan philosophers, but with Christian thinkers. Now, what Christian thinkers would they be? Well, they sifted through the libraries and monasteries that were left for early Christian writings. This man, Erasmus of Rotterdam, was maybe the chief among Christian humanists. A Dutch theologian, academic, and they didn't believe, by the way, these were educated men. They did not believe that the uneducated were, what's the word I'm looking for? They didn't believe the uneducated were qualified to be teachers or thinkers. They said, you know, if you didn't read Greek and Hebrew, you were just as likely to take everybody off the wrong way as these scholastic thinkers that were misleading everybody from the Catholic Church. So he produced a reliable Greek New Testament. He sought to restore piety and ethical behavior taught by Jesus, the apostles, and the early church. Now, the word piety just means reverence. I think it takes on a connotation of meekness or something like that, but it just means reverence. Let's see, there we go. He believed that the scholastic theologians impeded piety on every hand. In other words, what the scholastic theologians, these Catholic thinkers, were all about did nothing but lead people away from God. And he sought to lead people back to God. And these two groups conflicted significantly. Now, there was another guy named Thomas More who told a story about an Italian scholastic theologian. The story goes, this Italian merchant invited the scholastic theologian to a dinner. And just to make fun of how uneducated these guys were relative to Scripture, he would come up with, like if a book in the Bible had 16 chapters, he would bring up the 20th chapter and the 14th verse says this, and what do you think about it? And this theologian was like, oh, yes, well, that's a good point, and it actually means this. And this merchant, was just making sport of the guy, because this guy had no idea that passage didn't even exist. And so he said, I don't think that's quite right. And he made the guy so mad. He's like, how in the world could you not understand that I'm right? And here the guy was making a fool of himself, defending something that didn't even exist. But that's the way, and these groups fought back. They took great exception to this idea of wanting to go back to Scripture, to put Scripture in the hands of the people. Right? So there was a big conflict. Erasmus assailed the scholastic theologians in this way. He said, you may often find more true, authentic wisdom in one obscure individual, generally thought simple-minded and half crazy, whose mind has been taught by the heavenly Spirit of Christ, than in many strutting characters acting the theologian 3 or 4 times Dr. So-and-so, blown up with their Aristotle and stuffed full of learned definitions, conclusions, and propositions. Utter contempt. He believed the true source of Christian piety and learning was the Scriptures. He said, why devote the greater part of life to Averroes rather than the Gospels? Why spend nearly all of life on the ordinances of men and on opinions in contradiction with themselves? The latter, in fact, may now be the views of more eminent theologians, if you please, but certainly the first steps of the great theologian in the days to come will be these authors, meaning these authors, the Holy Scriptures. Let us all, therefore, with our whole heart, covet this literature. Let us embrace it. Let us continually occupy ourselves with it. Let us fondly kiss it. Let us die in its embrace. Let us be transformed in it, since indeed studies are transmuted into morals. In other words, morality comes from Scripture, and that's what they wanted to get back to. He said, if anyone wants to learn piety rather than disputation, let him straightway go to the sources and those writers who drank immediately from the sources. Now, Christian humanists believed that the theology of the Middle Ages had diverted Christianity from its primary goal, that of living a Christ-like life. The weird of it is, and you would think, and it did spur some of these men to be Protestants, but by and large, they stayed true to the Roman Catholic Church, because their aim was not to recover the primitive church, but to simply restore the teachings of ancient Christians and to learn from them the meaning of authentic Christian living and true spirituality. So, you're starting to see a difference here between Reformation and Restoration, right? or ideas, different ideas of restoration movements, okay? Because some restoration movements sought merely to restore the study of Scripture, to the restoration movement which we want to focus on, which focused on restoring first century church life, first century church worship, first century church thinking, okay? In fact, Erasmus believed that even if one could reconstruct a precise New Testament model of the church, which he doubted, it wouldn't be suitable for imitation in the present because conditions had changed. That's an interesting idea. It's like you couldn't restore the first century church, but even if you could, it wouldn't be appropriate to do. Now, what we're going to see as we go through this study is, as we get into the Reformation, guys that had learned from these Christian humanists, is that the argument is going to come down to, if Scripture is silent on an issue, then that's permission or that is denial. And really, that is what you see up to this current day, right? I mean, that's where a lot of denominations come from. That's, frankly, where a lot of disagreement is come about, even within churches of Christ. Is the silence of the Scripture permission, or is it prohibition? That's about all I've got for today, John. Anything you want to add? I know you don't want to say it out loud because it's hard to talk.
The issues that plagued us from the early 1800s into up to 1906 were driven by the strength of will and the educational points of the proponents. For example, we wound up first with the Missionary Society, and we fought that for a long time. And then we wound up with the question of the instrument, and the permutations of that go not only just to the Scripture, but to geography and to the war between the states. And even in the 1950s, with the movement we call the non-cooperative, or sometimes we call them the antis, came from how we interpret
Yes.
the Scripture.
Yeah, all of this comes down to interpretation. And we're going to see next week a man named Zwingli, Swiss theologian, and just a preview of coming events. Their interpretation of the silence on the music issue is so the music issue generally comes down to what? Whether or not to have instruments. Their idea of restoration was that you could not have any music because it said, sing and make melody in your heart, not out of your mouth. So you couldn't even sing in the worship. So how's that for interpretation, right? So everybody has, it's seemingly a different interpretation. So the question comes down to how do we unify with these differences of interpreting Scripture? And that's what has been the struggle really from a very, very long time ago. All right, any questions, comments? Nobody? All right. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week. Just pray that the baby behaves.